I think that essentially every single political party in India will be disappointed in my take on the Indus civilization. I know there's a huge push right now for it to have been a Dravidian civilization. There is no positivist evidence that shows that. None whatsoever. It's plausible, but a lot of things are plausible. That's not how history works, right? The bottom line is we don't know much about who the Indus civilization people were. I cite from the Therigatha, which is a collection of poems and hymns by Buddhist women collected in the early centuries BCE. And so I tell the story in part of the advent of Buddhism by using female voices of the Theris, the enlightened nuns. But around 65,000 years ago, another migrant group came, again coming roughly from Africa. It's especially strong in South India. And so we call those people the first Indians because they're the first ones to make it.
How the current politics looks at Indian history. How is your book responding to that?
I think my book is pretty staunchly and openly and decidedly a non-nationalist history.
My first question to you is that there's a very specific number that the title of your book has as 5,000 years of South Asian history. So could you elaborate a little bit as to how did you zero down on 5,000 years? And how and why both?
Sure. So for the last century, the conventional beginning of sort of Indian history, kind of recorded human history, has been about 4,600 years ago with the Indus civilization or the Indus Valley Civilization. And so that too is where I begin my narrative. We rounded up for the title because publishers like round numbers. That's where the 5,000 comes from. I don't adhere to it strictly. I do start sort of in earnest with the Indus civilization around 2600 BCE. Also, before that, I do give a brief account of how people sort of populated the subcontinent in the first place. And that's a story that goes back 120,000 years.
Okay. But I understand that, the first chapter of your book, it begins with the Indus Valley Civilization. So why did you choose to begin with the Indus civilization? Do we know that it was the beginning of Indian history and all of Indian history? Can we say that?
No, I think it depends on your perspective, right? I mean, the beginning of Indian history geologically goes back millions of years, right? To when the subcontinent is formed. The Himalayas are still rising from the crashing together of two tectonic plates. Human history goes back, as I said, around 120,000 years, give or take. I begin the book in the most, in a sense, conventional way a historian would do this, which is with recorded known human history, right? In a civilization that was robust enough, and they left behind significant material evidence for us to work with.
Okay.
Just because, so I should say, not all of the past is recoverable, okay? But history is a positivist discipline. We work with the evidence we have. And so there's no value judgment that the Indus civilization was somehow more important than other groups of people doing other things in India around the same time. It's simply that they're the ones for whom we have significant material evidence.
Okay, all right. We know that there's a lot of politics around the Indus civilization lately, with a lot of political parties trying to appropriate it along religious or regional lines. How do you respond to that? Do you think there is some truth to whatever the parties have to say about the Indus civilization?
I think that essentially every single political party in India will be disappointed in my take on the Indus civilization. I know there's a huge push right now for it to have been a Dravidian civilization. There is no positivist evidence that shows that. None whatsoever. It's plausible, but a lot of things are plausible. That's not how history works, right? The bottom line is we don't know much about who the Indus civilization people were. We know they built cities. We know how they lived. We know a fair amount about their diet, right? There's certain things that are recorded in the material and skeletal records, but we don't fundamentally know who they were, except that we think they were from northwestern India. That was a long time ago. How that maps on to modern linguistic and political and ethnic groups, we really don't know. And so for those who are making modern political claims, insofar as that's a political claim, I suppose I have less to say about it, but insofar as you're trying to make a historical claim, you need to be a little bit more concrete about the evidence.
Oh, thank you. There's also a section in your book where you speak about the first Indians. So could you elaborate a little bit on who were the first Indians?
Sure. I'm taking from Tony Joseph there, who has an excellent book called The First Indians, so that I highly recommend. Great book. Um, so the first Indians were not actually the first people to, like the first Homo sapiens to set foot on the Indian subcontinent. That would be the 120,000 years ago group, but they all died out. All right, about 65,000 years ago, another migrant group came. There may have been some in between, a little unclear on that. But around 65,000 years ago, another migrant group came, again, coming roughly from Africa, coming overland east. They enter the subcontinent, and some of those people survive. They have left behind a genetic lineage that is shared by some, not all, modern Indians, right? It's especially strong in South India. And those, so we call those people the first Indians because they're the first ones to make it.
Okay, got it. Thank you. There's also a section in your book that you mentioned, in which you mentioned that you have tried to include diverse voices and representation of diversity in your book. So, how do you do that? How could you give me some examples of how more women and the oppressed castes are represented in this book?
Absolutely. So like many historians right now, I think it's so important to have a more diverse set of voices when we're looking to the past, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's hard because the
Yes.
people who tend to be recorded tend to be members of dominant social groups. So in South Asia, that means they tend to be men, they tend to be upper caste, and they tend to be Hindu. And so I'm looking for people who don't fit that bill. I also think it's really important to bring in diverse voices, not just as, oh, here's somebody else on the side who you don't think about doing X, but rather to also bring in diverse voices to explain sort of key shifts in South Asian history. So, for
Mm.
example, I, of course, covered the advent of Buddhism about
Mm.
2,400 years ago. Any historian would cover that in an
Mm.
overview book. Um, Most people would probably cite from male authored Buddhist sources to talk about that, and I don't. I cite from the Therigatha, which is a collection of poems and hymns by Buddhist women collected in the early centuries BCE. And so I tell the story in part of the advent of Buddhism by using female voices of the Theris, the enlightened nuns. Um, Later on, I bring in, so far later, I bring in female voices, for example, when I talk about the Hindu reform movements and criticisms of Hinduism that arise in the 19th century. That's a well-known story. You know, the British show up, they have a lot of negative things to say about Hinduism, and Hindus respond in different ways, and that spawns the Hindu reform movements. But usually it's a
Mm.
straight up lineup of gentlemen that people talk about there. I talk about some of the men. I talk about Ram Mohan Roy and, I talk about
Mm.
Vivekananda. I also talk about Ramabai, right, who was an upper caste, she was a Brahmin Hindu woman, later in life converts to Christianity and writes actually a pretty good book called The High Caste Hindu Woman. Still pretty good reading
Mm.
today. And so
Mm.
lower castes are a little, they're, in a sense, it's harder even than to bring in female voices. For ancient India, we have very, like, little to nothing that's actually written by Shudras and Dalits, right? Let me note, I do
Mm.
use the word Dalit throughout the book, even though that's anachronistic, and that's
Mm.
to avoid using offensive terms for that broad-based group
Mm.
of people.
Mm.
Um, and so it's not till later that we get stuff authored by Shudras and Dalits, but I at least try to bring in texts about them. So, for example, I have a section where I'm talking about the 17th century and I talk about caste in the 17th century. I talk about
Mm.
some Shudra kings. That's great, but they are kings. I also print part of a Telugu drama written around 1700 CE. It's written by an upper caste individual, but it depicts a Brahmin in very poor light. All right, and this is the text, so folks don't get mad at me, get mad at the 1700 text. It depicts this Brahmin who is lusting after a Dalit woman and is, sort of abusing his Brahmanical privilege. He cites Sanskrit verses to her and sort of, plays with religion to try to get this Dalit woman to sleep with him. This is not a Dalit voice, but at least it's a Dalit character. So you
Mm.
work with what you have for the historical evidence. There is no getting around the fact that dominant groups are better represented in the South Asian historical record. That is true of
Yes.
all histories in all parts of the world.
Mhm.
But that
Mm.
should not absolve historians of doing the hard work of trying to recover what we can, both about and from the perspective of less discussed, less represented groups.
Mm. Thank you so much. you also say that Indian history, especially ancient India and medieval India, has always been connected with the world. Um, and you mentioned that how certain there are certain episodes, major historical episodes, in which India was connected to parts of the world. Can you elaborate a little bit on that as well? What are some of these major historical periods when India has been connected to the world?
I mean, from the beginning and throughout, right? I mean, how people get to India is a story of migration. The Indus Valley Civilization has extensive trade connections with Mesopotamia and possibly through Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt.
Mm,
The Vedic period, that's after the Indus civilization, those were migrants, right? They come from outside, they come into northwestern India, and then compose the Vedas. So the Vedas are an Indian composition, but the language group and that community does come from outside originally. There's trade connections throughout. The trade connections, which really get going in sort of the mid to late BCE era, those, it's via land to the north,
mm,
via sea, both east and west, and a little bit south as well. What you can move goods along, people can move along. So South Asians travel both out of the subcontinent. Migrant groups continue to come in. South Asia then has some pretty remarkable cultural exports, right? Starting in the few centuries before the turn into the CE era. And so, of course, Buddhism is probably the most well-known one, which travels both on the sea trade routes and along the Silk Roads, surviving ultimately
mm,
largely outside of the subcontinent.
mm,
There's also stories, the Panchatantra stories. There's games like chess and Parcheesi that are still popular across the West today. All of Sanskrit, which especially travels east to Southeast Asia, all of that attests to India and the subcontinent more broadly being part of an interconnected world. As always, for a historian, what's really fun are the details. So while the big picture is that India is always connected, I mean, what really gets me excited is thinking about that at specific points in time. Big picture, though, there's never a point where India is disconnected from the rest of the world, ever, including today. If anything, India is more connected today. Beginning, I
mm.
would say, the fact that
Yeah.
we're having this conversation in English and many
Yes.
Indians will listen to it in English. That's impossible to explain without extensive connections with the rest of the world.
Of course. Professor, with a book like this, there's always this question on what is included and what is excluded, because here you are mapping 5,000 years of Indian history. So, have you made any conscious choices in terms of how to include and what to include? And do you feel there is s- any significant chunk of Indian history that you think has been left out?
Hmm. So I will say I cut the vast majority of known South Asian history. That would be true of any book that covers this time period in the same amount of pages, right? And I
Mm,
mean,
yeah.
712 pages, you can't get much longer than that and keep it in a
Mhm.
single volume. Um, I think in terms of what I included and excluded, probably the biggest difference is that I cut a lot of kings.
A lot of
So
kings. Okay. Mm,
for those who want, so for decades, many people have told what they say is the history of South Asia. What they've really told is the political history of South Asia. Political history is important. Trust me, there's a
mm,
lot of rulers in the pages of my book, kings and queens, and later prime ministers and presidents.
mm,
However, political history is only one kind of history. There's also
mm,
religious history, social history, material history, economic history. All of those are just as important as political history. In order to make room for talking about, say, fashion in, what jewelry you wore 2,500 years ago, all the way through to I talk about Bollywood in the present day,
mm,
you have to cut stuff to make room for that, right? Otherwise, you just, you never finish the book. So, for those who think they're interested in South Asian history but really just want all the dynasties, I would direct you to other books. That's not my book, right? Um, I would also say, and I have a bit at the end of the book where I actually deal with this issue of like, how dare you not cover fill in the blank? Because I think a lot of people are going to have that, right? There's a lot of people that are attached to, if they're academics, what they study in South Asian history. If they're popular, if they're not academics, where they're from or their sort of favorite bit of South Asian history. And I think a lot of people are going to be upset
mm,
that, I cut their favorite bit. Um, And I do plead to consider what cutting that allowed me to include, right?
Mm.
Um, Also, it's an overview book. It's not a comprehensive book. I don't think it is possible to write a comprehensive book of 5,000 years of history. Um, but also, one other thing I'll say that might help for folks who are a little upset, a little miffed that I cut their favorite bit. Um, so one thing that I do is I do try to get a bit of every kind of history in the book, not just the politics, but all the other stuff
Mm.
too. And in order to do that, if I go, say, heavy on political history in one chapter, in the next chapter, I might not have so much on that. If, say, I go heavy on religious history in a particular chapter, well, the next chapter might be a little bit more about society and land and economics and things like that, right?
Mm. Mm.
Um, and so I do try to mix it up. That results sometimes in some interesting omissions. All right.
Yeah.
But as I say at some point in the book to my readers, don't let it be the last book you read on South Asian history. It's one book, it's not the only one.
Okay, I have one last question here. We know that, right now, the Indian history has become a very hot topic of debate, particularly with a lot of arguments about nationalism and what constitutes Indian history, and what is to what extent we have the way we have been studying history as of till until now, that itself is being challenged by the dominant political mood in the country right now. How would you say that your book addresses the current political mood in India when it comes to uh, how the current politics looks at Indian history? How is your book responding to that?
So I would say in sort of two different ways. One is that I think my book is pretty staunchly and openly and decidedly a non-nationalist history, right? I
Okay.
mean, among other
Mhm.
things, I am an American by nationality, so that wouldn't work
Mhm.
out so well, right? Um, Down to the title. And I say this in the introduction, the India of the title, that is not the modern nation state of India. The modern nation state of India was born like yesterday from a historian's perspective, right? I mean,
Mm.
it's
Mm.
less than a century old, right?
Mm.
That's very, very recent. I use India in the title and throughout most of the book until the last couple of chapters in its historic sense of the subcontinent. So it's a geographical designation. It very much includes Bangladesh, Pakistan, and southern parts of Afghanistan as well. Um,
Mm.
and I realize that's going to be a little uncomfortable for a lot of readers who are really used to India being the modern nation states with militarized borders and an army and a set of nationalist symbols. And I am trying to challenge that. That's not what India has been historically. Maybe that's what you think India is now. I have less to say about that. But historically, history doesn't culminate in you. It doesn't culminate in the modern Indian state. This is just another moment. I think the second way that I address nationalism, and I think this will be particularly important for younger readers, right? So under the age of, I would say, about 30, 35, is I do give a fair amount of the history of Hindu nationalism, right?
Okay. Mm.
And I think Hindu nationalists don't like talking about their own history. There's some dark parts of that history, the Nazi-loving stuff, the fascist stuff, the fact that it's largely a European importation, and the fact that it was very unpopular for most of its existence. Right? 40 years
Mm.
ago, no respectable Indian would touch Hindu nationalism. And I think that that's very hard to understand if, say, you're 30 years old and living in Hyderabad or Bombay or Delhi or Ahmedabad or wherever, and Hindutva is what you know, right? It's the political mainstream from your perspective. So this is what history offers. It gives you another perspective, a much longer one. And so
Mm.
I am trying to provide, and this comes in the later chapters of the book, a bit of education on the history of Hindu nationalism, on its embrace of violence, on its historic origins, which, as I said, are in Europe ultimately, not in India. And to talk about why most Indians didn't want anything to do with it, right? Especially for the first about 60 years of its
Mm.
existence. And so I would encourage young readers, you can think about it, especially if you come from a family that supports Hindu nationalism, think about it in personal terms. Maybe you support
Mm.
Hindutva, maybe you love Modi, maybe your parents
Mm.
do,
Mm.
but your great grandparents almost certainly did not. And why is that? And what has changed? And what other possibilities are out there? These are the
Mm.
promises of studying history.